Let's talk about the spookiest and scariest legion of Space Marines, the Night Lords. A legion of batshit crazy emo vampire wannabes, the Night Lords were an incredibly effective terror weapon before the Heresy. They have since devolved into disparate bands of scavengers and nomadic renegades, even less organised than most other groups of Chaos Marines. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning, when they weren't the Night Lords, but simply the 8th Legion. Created by the Emperor as a terror weapon to discourage rebellions, the Marines of the 8th Legion were almost super Astartes. All the legions were effective shock troops who were best used to cause fear in an enemy, but only the Night Lords took that and made it their entire personality. They looked to recruit from amongst the worst criminals that ancient terror had to offer, monsters whose crimes were so unspeakable that they were contained in underground complexes to keep them apart from the population of the planet. The offspring of these prisoners adapted to the conditions of their environment, becoming pale and silent stalkers that were avoided by even the boldest and most hardened criminals. Known as the Night's Children, it was they who would become the first recruits of the fledgling 8th Legion. Implanted with the gene seed of everyone's favourite mopey arsehole Konrad Curze, their pale skin would become bone white and their eyes pitch black. The adaptations of the gene seed would give the recruits the ability to see in complete darkness. However, they would need the lenses of their power armour to shield their eyes in daylight, leading to them developing a preference for night operations. Conveniently for them, this fit their whole terror vibe pretty well. Predictably, recruiting the children of some of the worst criminals that terror had to offer and turning them into super soldiers using the gene seed of emo Batman didn't exactly foster a healthy outlook amongst the 8. They didn't believe in moral grey areas or ambiguity. Either you were a part of the Imperium or you were an enemy that needed to be purged in the most terrifying way possible, such that nobody else would be tempted to repeat your actions. There were no shades of grey in the 8th Legion's moral outlook, no degrees of guilt or innocence, only right and wrong, justice or death. They also tended towards stoicism and a grim lack of humour, accepting their role as the bloody judgment of the Imperium grudgingly, viewing it as a necessary evil rather than taking pleasure in slaughter, at least in the beginning. The 8th Legion's moral outlook was shared by their gene father, Konrad Curze. When the Chaos Gods abducted and scattered the infant primarchs, baby Curze would crash on Nostramo, a world of perpetual darkness and insane crime rates. Unlike the other primarchs who were found by their planet's inhabitants, for better or for worse, depending on whether your name was Rebute or Mortarion, Konrad was left to fend for himself, which didn't exactly go great. If you were one of the 7 people who watched my first video, you would know that Space Marines and primarchs possess an organ that allows them to absorb the memories of living beings that they consume. When you combine that organ, a planet full of hardened criminals, and a young primarch that has to eat, you end up with a baby Curze who was constantly confronted with the memories of some of the worst examples of humanity you could imagine. This, obviously, did not provide a healthy environment for my baby boy, and he decided that he would personally clean up Nostramo, even if he had to eat every toddler on the planet to do so. Like a much more violent Batman, Curze would become such a menace to the people of Nostramo that the crime rates dropped drastically, leaving the population afraid to do so much as litter out of fear of the Night Haunter, as he styled himself. And to be fair to Curze, that title goes unreasonably hard, which is somewhat of a trend amongst the Night Lords. They have an undeniable sense of dramatic flair. Unfortunately, if a society is only held back from falling into anarchy through fear of a single man, and just spitballing here, say the Emperor of Mankind showed up and took that man away, then that society is destined to fall back into lawlessness, which is exactly what happened. Without Konrad there to keep the populace in a state of constant terror, Nostramo would fall back into its old ways, a wretched hive of scum and villainy once more. Despite this, the initial melding of Curze with his legion was pretty smooth compared to his brothers. Nostraman runes and traditions were quickly taken up by the warriors of the legion, and Konrad's drive to enact justice and punish wrongdoers matched his newfound sons perfectly. The Night Lords were also one of the most effective legions during the Great Crusade, at least in terms of ensuring compliance with relatively few casualties, preferring instead to target the planet's rulers and make an example of them. So fearsome was their reputation that the mere mention of the 8th Legion's deployment would make worlds fall into line, leading to them having the lowest kill count amongst all of the legions, and leaving the planets they conquered able to function much more effectively post-compliant. See what I meant about them being essentially super Astartes? Despite its effectiveness, their reliance on terror tactics and asymmetrical warfare would give them a reputation for cowardice, and led to their brother legions viewing them as barbaric and weak. And as the Crusade ground on, this reputation would become more and more true. Having a world as overrun with crime and sadism as Nostramo, as the Legion's main recruiting world, did absolutely nothing for their reputation as essentially a criminal gang masquerading as space marines. By the time of the Heresy, many Night Lords were sadistic serial killers and sociopaths, hiding their bloodlust beneath a thin veneer of loyalty to their father and the Crusade, no longer viewing their duty as a necessary evil, but rather delighting in shedding the blood of those weaker than themselves. Ostracized from their brother legions by their reputation, and only barely trusted, many began to wonder why the Emperor allowed the Night Lords to operate as they did without censure. Konrad himself didn't exactly help his legion's social standing. He was widely disliked among his brothers, who thought him unstable. The closest thing to friendship he had with his fellow primarchs was with Fulgrim, which isn't exactly a ringing endorsement. Like Sanguinius, Curze possessed the gift of foresight, able to see both positive and negative futures at once. Unlike Sanguinius, however, Curze was nothing if not fatalistic. He believed that the negative future would always be the one that would come to pass, and this would eventually drive him to insanity. It was this, along with an argument with Rogel Dawn that led to his imprisonment, that would push Curze to return to Nostramo and destroy the planet, after it had completed its slide back into anarchy. Understandably, the Emperor was not best pleased by that, and recalled the Legion to Terra to punish them for their transgression. Curze viewed this not as a deserved punishment for, again, blowing up a planet, but as unfairly criticising him for performing the very role he and his sons had been created for. This might have held a little bit more weight if he were less demonstrably insane, but that's neither here nor there. By the time the Heresy erupted, the Night Lords were already a renegade legion in all but name, having lost what little faith they once had in the ideals of the Imperium, and siding with Horus and the other traitors would simply provide them with an excuse to embrace that title. While they were among the largest of the legions throughout the Heresy, the Night Lords were at this point far from united, divided by petty rivalries in their ranks that could quickly turn violent, with some members dismissive of, or even openly hateful towards, Curze. The commanding officers of the 8th Legion often ruled through fear, threats, or bribery, remarkably unlike the bonds of loyalty and iron discipline that bound their brother legions. Despite this, they would be present during the infamous drop site massacre that marked the outbreak of the Heresy. It was actually Sevatar, their first captain and all-round cool guy, who coined the phrase "death to the corpse emperor." Pretty cool. During this battle, Konrad would duel his brother Korax, though unfortunately he did this to save Lorgar. He would also take his other brother Vulcan prisoner, torturing him and repeatedly murdering him before getting his shit absolutely rocked by the perpetual Primarch. After this, admittedly embarrassing, setback, Curze would embark on the Thramas Crusade against the Dark Angels, a campaign that would last for 3 years before Konrad was captured by the Lion on Sagwalsa, and a large part of his legion would take this opportunity to abandon their father and flee into the void. Some would simply disappear, fracturing into thousands of warbands across the stars, while some would fight on the side of the traitors during the Siege of Terra, although they were among the first to abandon that battle once it turned. Curze would later, briefly, escape to cause a bit of a ruckus during the Imperium Secundus project, before being jettisoned into space by Sanguinius, and running off back to Sagwalsa. It was here that Konrad would fall deeper into his insanity, and wait to be found by a Calidus assassin sent by the Emperor, a fate that he had foreseen and would not attempt to stop, as that would have shattered his entire worldview about fate being predetermined, and therefore he hadn't actually done anything wrong if you really think about it. Your presence does not surprise me, assassin. I have known of you ever since your craft entered the eastern fringes. Why did I not have you killed? Because your mission, and the act you are about to commit, proves the truth of all I have ever said or done. I merely punished those who had wronged, just as your false emperor now seeks to punish me. Death is nothing compared to vindication. As last words go, that's definitely up there. After the Heresy, the Night Lords would continue to splinter further, devolving into bands of renegades and pirates, employed as mercenaries by the larger and more organised groups of heretic Astartes. They also feature in my absolute favourite piece of literature to ever come out of 40k, The Night Lord's Omnibus by Aaron Dembski Bowden. Seriously, if you haven't already read those books, do yourself a favour and read them. They're wonderful, and I will absolutely be making an entire video about them in future. nature. They do a really good job of making you root for the squad of Night Lords they follow, even when they are absolutely still the bad guys of the story. Despite being traitors, many Night Lords are not overly fond of the Chaos Gods, shunning their gifts and only rarely making use of demons. However, this tendency has definitely been over-exaggerated within the community over time, and they are definitely still Chaos tainted, just not as much as some of the other traitor legions. Even First Claw, the squad from the omnibus I mentioned earlier, had a slavering Khornate berserker, a devotee of Slaanesh, and were commanded by a Tzeentch demon inhabiting the body of their captain. Even so, the gene seed of the Night Lords remains amongst the purest of the traitor legions, so they've got to be doing something right. Their tactics and methods of war have remained remarkably similar, from their origins on Terra through to their comparatively pitiful existence in the current day of the setting. Scare the enemy into submission in the most efficient way possible, whether that be by hiding in the dark before jumping out and shouting boo, or broadcasting the screams of their previous victims so loudly that it bursts the eardrums of any mortals listening. They don't exactly do fair fights. They either win with overwhelming force, or they retreat until such time as they are able to stack the odds in their favour. So that was the Night Lords, their history, Primarch, and current antics. If you've watched this far in the video, thank you so much. It really does mean a lot. Let me know in the comments if there's anything I missed or you want to add, like, subscribe, all the rest, and I'll see you in the next video.